Okay, welcome. We're so glad to have all of you here today. I'm Bess Marcus, the Dean of the School of Public Health, and really excited to have you all for this exciting event. This is our keynote for Black History Month, and we're so excited to have our guest speaker with us, Dr. Stephanie Coard. So Dr. Coard is an associate professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies at UNC Greensboro, and she's really been a leader in the field of resilience, and we'll be hearing a lot about resilience from her and her work. And resilience is a topic of great importance to the School of Public Health, and one of our themes, actually, that's emerged in our strategic planning. So we're very excited to hear what she has to say. She's chaired the American Psychological Association Task Force on Resilience and Strength in Black Children and Adolescents, and she's really been leveraging her work with individuals and communities to build strength and resilience in children. So I think one of the things that's really important about her work is focusing on the strengths-based approach rather than the risk and deficit-based approach that we see so much of in the literature, and really turning the conversation. And so we're excited to hear about that from her. As I mentioned, this is an area of importance to the school that we're really investing in, and we're delighted to have Dr. Coard with us, and we're hoping to bring other speakers like her to campus to really build our focus in this area of resilience. After her talk today, Dr. Caroline Kuo will be facilitating a discussion so that we really want you to both listen and absorb the great work she's doing and think about how it applies to the work you are doing or you want to do, and be able to have time to have questions and a discussion about that. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Coard.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I can put that here so it doesn't interfere with me. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I am so happy to be here. I'm honored to have been invited. It is quite cold. I tell you, I feel like I've been hazed a little bit. I had to do that hill and, you know. But honestly, you all have been so warm, so thank you. Thank you, Caroline, and thank you, Jamie. Really, I appreciate this. And I just hope at the end of this, at least it will get you thinking and just kind of generating ideas about strength and about resilience. And, you know, one of the challenges was, oh my gosh, resilience is such a huge topic. There's so much you can talk about. And there's so many different ways in which we think about it in our work. So I had to just kind of step back and say, okay, I'm going to just stay true to what I know, and I'm going to speak to it, try to speak to it specifically as it relates to some work I'm doing, as it relates to racism and responses to racism, and the idea of finding resilience even in risk. Okay? So what do we know about families? Well, we know that they're key. We know that they play a critical role in our lives. And we know that influence and that key role extends beyond just the basic needs. Of course, clothing and food and shelter and that sort of thing. But we know that families, particularly parents, are primary socializing agents, right? And so this socializing force and this influence, we also know, is influenced by social factors, some positive, some negative. For African Americans, family also reflects all of that, but it also reflects the legacy of racism. But also, in my opinion, amazing resilience. The families that I work with are African American for the most part, are multi-stressed, have a lot going on. That's what I say. I say, people ask me, well, you work with low-income families? I work with families that got a lot going on. And I was telling someone earlier, I learned so much from them. And just to be in their presence, it's resilience, because I learn about the resourcefulness and I learn about the strategies that they're doing in the midst of something that I can't even identify with, let's just be honest. And I walk away and I'm like, wow, like really? I'm fussing about this and worrying about that, and these folks really are teaching me a lot. So we know there's been lots of research on African American families, but I contend that, there are many criticisms. I'm sure none of these will be unfamiliar to you. Preoccupation with race differences and problematic behavior and functioning. I mean, oftentimes folks want to look at race for the sake of looking at race. It's interesting. I am on a review panel for a government agency, and I just got off review. We do 4 times a year, and I was just on this last review of applications. And I have to say, every review panel, these play out. And there was one particular application, and I'm, folks are kind of excited about it. Oh, look at these differences. This would be really interesting. But what are you going to do with those differences? Okay, so if you find them, let's say you do find the differences, how are you prepared to ground those findings in anything that speaks to the lived experiences of these families? Oh, yeah, well, okay, so, and it's a challenge because I feel that it's important for individuals or researchers, rather, who come with this expertise to be on these panels, but it's also a burden. It's hard, because, oftentimes you're it. And so, I want to do my part, but my point being that these things are not, in the past. Unfortunately, they're still current day. Confounding of race and social class. I'm sure you get that a lot. Interpretations of differences as deficits. Common sense would say you should, not do that. But like I'm saying, I see it pretty regularly. Use of measures, unknown validity, reliability. Inadequate unpacking of the role of race and ethnicity and culture. And that's really what I'm passionate about. I'm passionate about, I don't want to control for this. I want to look into that. Like, what is that? It's messy. It's, it's complex, but I'm really interested in thinking about how the role of race and ethnicity impacts human development, how it impacts family functioning. So I want to give meaning to those racial factors. And then, of course, preoccupation with disparity data. Now, I contend that, of course, we know that there are disparities. We know that there are gaps, and I get that. But I'm at the point where enough. Okay, so we know that they exist. Let's think a little deeper and think about why they may exist, but most importantly, how can we make meaning and how can we pivot from that in a way that's culturally relevant and, again, speaks to the lived experiences of those that we're speaking with or talking to or researching, rather. So my goals for today, I want to talk a little bit about racism and discrimination. And I also want to familiarize you with some research many of you may be familiar with and others may not, that is specific to research that I'm doing on racial socialization, but also others, because there are others, mentors and other colleagues that are doing fabulous work that as a package is so incredibly rich and important. So I want to look at some of the cultural resources and coping strategies in response to racism, and particularly interested in looking at resilience within the context of relationships and parent-child relationships in particular. And I find that fascinating, both as a professional, but also as a mother of 3. And then hopefully stimulate your critical thinking about how we can then think about this going forward and how we can kind of get deeper in our own research and in our own practice with African American families. Now, I'm sure everybody in here probably knows what racism is, but for the sake of this talk, I just want to give you a sense of how I'm thinking about it. And for the sake of this talk, I am thinking about these very sort of globally. We can pick and dissect racism in all different ways, but basically I'm talking in general, individual racism, institutional racism, cultural racism. I wanted to at least give acknowledgement to the distinctions and commonalities between these levels of racism. So when I'm talking about racism, I'm talking about this in totality. And I believe that it encompasses all of these factors. So we know that racism has negative consequences for the health and mental health of African Americans. There are numerous studies that have documented that. Again, it is what it is, and I'm not denying that that's the case, and I'm not denying that it's not impacting in multiple levels in very complex ways. But again, looking at resilience or looking at strength within risk. Okay, so yeah, I know that's the case, but I'm also encouraged. I'm also encouraged because both anecdotally, but also as a researcher, I am encouraged because I see how African Americans are showing resilience and showing strength within the midst of that, and particularly in response to racial stigma and racism. And in an effort to guard against those negative forces, I see how parents are trying to buffer, protect, prepare their children for a world that does not always have their best interest at heart. And one of the things that is particularly challenging is how to facilitate this process with parents and in families when you have parents that are struggling with making sense of it themselves, okay? They're having to manage their own stress, their own trauma, their own experiences related to this, and at the same time, they have to then lift up Jamie and lift up, Bobby and lift up Sally and make them feel empowered. I mean, how do you reconcile that? How do you do that? It is not an easy task, but families are doing it. And are they challenged? Absolutely. And that's one reason why I'm so interested in intervention research and developing programs and services to help foster this, to help prepare parents and help facilitate it so that it can optimally benefit their youth. So what is this racial socialization? Call it racial socialization, you've seen it racial ethnic socialization, you see it called cultural socialization. But basically, in a nutshell, racial socialization is two particular major themes. And the first one really, I think, historically has been sort of the basis for racial socialization, in that if you think back to, say, like the early 80s, Peters and Boykin, Wade Boykin and his triple quandary, where he talked about, and she talked about the fact that, parents have to talk to kids about who they are and what that means, okay? And so basically, racial socialization involves the process by which parents transmit these messages inter and intra-generationally about who you are, okay, about your history, about what that means, and about the significance of race and ethnicity. But then it doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop there because it's not enough to talk to your kids about how great they are, right? I mean, that would be nice, but the reality is that they're living in a society that's racially conscious. They're living in a society where others aren't always going to give them similar messages. As a matter of fact, they live in a society where they will be getting counter messages. So it's important to also teach behaviors, okay? You can give them the content, give them the information, but it's important to teach children the problem-solving skills that are associated with the interactions that they are likely to come in contact with, okay? So problem-solving skills that enable them to be flexible in their approaches to race-related situations without losing a core sense of self. So not only what is the information and what do you need to know, but what happens when you're in a context where you're getting a different message? How do you respond to that? And I know personally, as a mother, and I have to say that this is similar to parents I've worked with as well. I think when I initially found out that I was expecting my first child, it was like, oh, wow, that's great. I'm excited. Although I'll be honest, I thought I had like some disease. I didn't know what it was. So I'm not even gonna lie, I did not know. I kind of was like not feeling well. I had self-diagnosed myself with all sorts of things. So when I finally found out that I was like, oh goodness, that's great. But then the second thing was, wow, how am I gonna raise a little boy, a little chocolate boy or girl in this society. Wow. So I went from a very sort of elated response to one of like anxiety and concern and fear. So this is something that I think that resonates with parents, even if they don't know that there's a literature about it, even if they don't know what it's named or what it's called. There's a certain angst and a certain level of hypervigilance that a parent has about what it will mean for their child to be raised in a racially conscious society. So there's been lots of research on this, and I just want to highlight a little bit of it. So the first thing is, in that first area of racial socialization, or the first tenet, rather, of the content of racial socialization, this information that is being transmitted, research has shown that there are various areas of content that are the focus of parents in terms of their teachings around race and around what that means. Racial pride, of course. Okay, you want the child to feel good about who they are and prideful in their own skin, right? And so teaching about heritage, exposing them to cultural events, talking about unity and pride and commitment, all of those things sound real good and are very important to do. And then we have racism preparation. So that gets a little sticky because it's not just about the fact that you're good and you're pretty and you're smart and all those things. It's about the real world and the fact that there are blocked opportunities and there's something called racism, there's something called minority status, there's something that is out there that is not necessarily going to embrace you. And how do you have children make sense of that? And so you need to teach them strategic protocol, adaptive racial orientation, all of those things. I remember even struggling with myself as a parent thinking, wow, okay, I want to make sure that when, not if, when my children were called the N-word, that they were prepared. And I think all three of them, it was done by the time they were 8. So, I really struggled with the fact that, I want to inoculate them with pride and empowerment and strength, but how do I handle this reality that exists? And the reality is that this reality is not particularly developmentally appropriate. So that's why it becomes such a challenge, because kids are experiencing things that at their developmental level, they shouldn't be experiencing, but they do, and they have to, and it is what it is. And then we have racial equality, and that's sort of the nice pleasantries. We're all human, we all come from the human race, peaceful coexistence, treat others the way you would want to be treated, all those things that are all very nice and important as well. And then in this particular research, the theme of achievement came up too, and just the idea that you need to work hard and you need to have a initiative and leadership and all of that. And sometimes that achievement piece comes up into the racial pride part, but in this particular study, it sort of fell out on its own. So there are these content messages that are very important according to research. These 4 common themes we also see in the work of Hughes and Chen that have done lots of work in this area as well, and you can see common overlap. Cultural socialization, again, teaching them about racial history and racial heritage and pride. Preparation for bias, the awareness of discrimination, egalitarianism. What they also have found is that there's this component of promotion of mistrust, emphasizing the need to be wary, don't trust too quickly when it comes to interracial interactions. Now, these themes have been pretty much endorsed. When those of us who do this work, these themes are pretty consistent across. We give them different names, but they're very consistent across the board. And so research has looked at, okay, so what is it that's really inoculating and fostering a sense of resilience in children? What is it that we really need to be teaching? And what research has shown is that cultural socialization, or racial pride, as you saw in the previous slide, and preparation for bias are basically the most, well, not necessarily the most, because egalitarian is also heavily used, but those are the most pivotal, important constructs in teaching children. Where the challenge comes into play is how to hit that sweet spot, and that is how do you balance those. We know that with younger children, cultural pride messages are important as building a foundation, and then you want to then come in with the preparation for bias. But like I said, it's a challenge because children at earlier and earlier ages are dealing with messages where those prep for bias messages are critical. They're on the playground, okay, at 3, at 4, at 5 years old, and they're having to deal with bias types of interactions from their peers. Your skin is dirty. Mommy says, I can't play with you. You know, why does your hair look like that? You know, just different insults. They're children, right? But insults that they don't necessarily know why they're saying it. But in any case, these are, you know, insults to other children. And so this happens in the context of play and very positive interactions. And children don't necessarily know how to make sense of it. So again, very consistent across research in terms of the types of themes that we see. And we also know that parents do these things differently. They transmit these messages in different ways. Active. I would say that that's really what I want it to be. I want it to be active. I want it to be proactive. I wanted to make sure that I prepared my kids before it took place, right? So I was being very intentional and very strategic. And so you have parents that are ahead of the game. They're teaching their children, preparing their children in an attempt to buffer what they know is coming down the pipe, right? And then you have parents that are what I would call responsive. Things happen, and they're responding to it, okay? The child comes home after an incident that's occurred at school. Mommy, this is what happened, and then you go into mode of like trying to fix it, okay? Whether it's damage control or whether it's more of a extensive type of intervention, but you're responding to what it is that the child brings to you. And oftentimes parents will do this with respect to even talking about things like, well, I'll just wait until she comes to me, or he comes to me, or this happens, right? While responsive is important, it's not optimal because, again, racial socialization is something that we have found needs to be done intentionally, strategically, and purposely in order for it to be optimally beneficial. But that's responsive. And then we have parents that are passive. We have parents that underutilize racial socialization. But I contend that even a parent that says that they don't racially socialize their child is socializing their child. I've had parents that say, oh, we don't talk about that stuff. He sees it in the news, or, you know, he sees what's going on. They know what's going on. These kids are smarter than us these days. I've had parents say that. And I help them understand by you not talking about it, you're talking about it. You're giving a message about it, whether that it's something that's taboo and can't be talked about, or that you don't think it's important enough. I mean, who knows what the child is making meaning of. But passive tends to be parents, in my experience, that know it's important, but just don't know how to go about doing it. Stressful. I mean, it's stressful to talk about sex and drugs and being safe and, you know, just basic things, right, that you even have control over. How do you even begin to get your head wrapped around talking to your child about something that you don't have control over? And it's talking to them about their own existence. I mean, they can't change who they are or what they look like, right? So how do you even go about trying to troubleshoot that? Very important, very difficult. What I wanted you to get out of this slide, again, is going back to what I was, oh, I guess I have a little thing here. Is that the red? Ooh, there we go. Is this part here, okay? Racial pride is definitely something that's easier for parents to do, okay? Stories and your prayers and your traditions and all those, activities that really instill a sense of pride. Pretty easy. Racial preparation and racial equality, okay? So, parents are tending to do all of these things. But again, I think the challenge is really these two right here. We know that racial pride is important, but we also know the importance of racial prep. But we know that giving too much of this without enough of that actually can work counter. And we know its importance. Empirical findings have shown that racial socialization has positive influence in association with racial competence, academic achievement, their self-efficacy and self-esteem, behavioral competence, and we also see it in terms of decreases of delinquency and drug abuse. And it's not rocket science, right? The more a child feels comfortable in their own skin, but more importantly, the more that they feel that they have a repertoire of tools and skills to respond in a way, hopefully, that's not going to be maladaptive, we'll give them other choices, right? But we also know that racial socialization is so incredibly complex. It's not just sitting down and having a talk, one talk. It is happening constantly, synergistic, it's dynamic, it's happening when you don't even know it's happening. And research shows it's bidirectional, meaning that parents facilitate discussion or interaction around race. Kids also initiate it, right? I would say it's not even just bidirectional. I think it's multidimensional because I think there are multiple, besides the family, there are multiple agencies of socialization. They're getting messages at school and in the classroom, in the community, and at the YWCA, and at the soccer practice, and their messages around race, who they are, and where their positionality is within that is happening in all these different systems. So I would really say it's not even just a bidirectional process, because parents, in my experience, are struggling with trying to maintain all these different messages, make sure that theirs is the prominent message, but kids are getting messages from all over. And social media now? Oh my goodness. Social media, that's a whole nother talk. Really, how do you even, social media. Transmission and reception. We know that what oftentimes parents say they transmit is not always what you say they got. So that's always really interesting. Rarely do you see common ground, particularly with adolescents. Parents think, yeah, I nailed that. I got it. She's ready, and then it's like, wow, oh, I thought you were talking about, And, it's interesting because you just got to, you just think about just typical adolescent development, and you think about parent-adolescent communications. And adding this on top of that, you can imagine, but that is a huge tension, just that transmission and reception, and getting adolescents and parents, or children and parents on the same page with that, or getting parents to a point where they can get to that child, speak in that child's language and at that age where that child could understand it. We know that it's moderated by family ecological factors, depending on where you live. If you live in a neighborhood that you are the only white family for miles and miles and miles, that's a very different message and experience and context than living amongst people that look all like you, okay? And we also know that it's gendered. Fathers and mothers do it differently. They have different styles. Again, in my experience, fathers tend to be very raw about it. There's no touchy-feely, let me pack this nice and pretty and put a bow on it. African American fathers are going for the jugular, really, because they feel like they have to. They've got to get the messages in. And again, it's not that they don't, it's not about, ignoring development. I think, well, that's another story. It's just about, again, it speaks to the fear and the anxiety around it. I got to get this message out. By any means necessary, I need this message to be transmitted. Whereas, mothers will tend to be more relational and be more nurturing about it. But I've also found in my research that fathers are experiencing it different than, or Black men are experiencing it different than women, but they're both experiencing it in different ways. So we know that it's gendered in terms of how it's communicated. We also know that the types of messages that get received or the types of messages that are deemed important are different, whether it's a boy or a girl. Okay, so with girl messages, yeah, they tend to deal with things around appearance and beauty and the fact that you're good enough and you're smart enough and you're attractive and all those types of things. With boys, interestingly, we spend a lot of time, and I say we, and I'm talking in general, both from personal but also professional experience and working with families, we spend a lot of time trying to keep African American boys under the radar. And the reason why we do that is because we don't want them to be a target. We see that they're easy targets. We see 10-year-olds being treated or observed to be 21-year-olds. Kids can't be kids. I've told my son since he was being a class clown is not an option for you. Let's just keep it real. It may be an option for Johnny, but it is not an option for you because you won't be seen as the class clown. And as many observations I've been asked to come do in a classroom, trouble child, oftentimes it's not the child at all, it's the context. And so, there are just certain protocols that we have to discuss with the children. And so we spend a lot of time trying to keep African American boys under the radar. We tell them what not to do. Don't walk too fast, don't move too fast, don't talk too loud, okay? And I understand where that's coming from because it's in response to, I think, a sense of a perception of intimidation, a perception of fear that folks have, okay, which is why we see different behaviors and responses to Black men, whether we're in the mall, okay, or on the street or in an elevator. And so I think parents are really struggling with trying to make sure that their child does not stand out. Think about it, even just biologically, think about just pubertal development. We know that Black boys and Black girls develop 2 years ahead of their white counterparts. So that 10-year-old is looking very different, African American 10-year-old may be looking very different than that 10-year-old white little boy. Their voices are changing. They're talking to a teacher, and it's like, so this is a child. He's big, he's stocked. Let's just say, so the physicalness, and sort of the movement and the style, that there's something about that has been perceived as intimidating. And so we spend a lot of time trying to keep kids, Black boys in particular, under the radar. But what do we do by doing that, though? I think about this a lot. I think, when I think about African American boys, I think we have spent so much time socializing them about what not to do, we haven't adequately told them what they can do or how to do. And so, so I think the protocol that we'll talk a little bit about becomes becomes a little complicated. With girls, I don't know, girls, we're kind of more, society's a little bit more forgiving because, girl power, you can do it all, right? So it's gendered. So now this comes from some work that I did as part of the task force looking at resilience and strength in Black children and adolescents. And we contend that there are some other things that are really important, some of which I kind of alluded to or can be thought of within the contents that I've already spoken of, but are a little bit more sophisticated and go in a little bit more depth. So critical mindedness, to protect against experiences of discrimination and critique existing social conditions. So critical mindedness, that's really key for Black children in particular to master. You have to be able to go into a situation, assess a situation, and you got to be able to assess it quick. And you have to be able to critique and be very sort of intentional and proactive in what your existence means in that environment. Active engagement, a sense of personal agency, and exercising control over nature and over the quality of one's life. Flexibility is important, Parents, African American parents, in terms of socializing their children, we tell them flexibility is important because you've got to know how to navigate and negotiate the terrain of racism. You've got to know how to navigate different social, you have to know how to navigate different places and spaces. And sometimes they may look like you, and sometimes they may not look like you. But you still need to be in those spaces because you don't have the luxury of stepping out of those spaces, if that makes sense, right? So flexibility is really key. I mean, some may call it code switching. I mean, there's different, terms that we use for it, but being able to be fluid and flexible. I was talking earlier about, my son, the fact that he plays ice hockey, which is not a sport that you see many that look like him. And he's been playing since he was 5. And I have learned so much from just watching him navigate, negotiate. And I want to say I've had something to do with that. But I'm not always with him because he's, been living away, playing hockey. But that flexibility is important because you've got to feel comfortable with who you are in your own skin in different spaces and places and to be able to just be fluid and flexible and be competent in those different settings. And I've seen kids even have to experience this in, busing. You're taking a child from one environment and sending them to a school in another environment, I've had kids give very sort of concrete, purposeful examples to me of how their transition from getting on the bus to getting off that bus on the other side of town. Everywhere from how they need to turn their head, their cap, turn their head, yeah, right. Turn their caps, okay? Whether they have on jewelry, the shirts that they wear, button it up versus letting it not. I mean, just this whole protocol just on the bus trip. And then when they go home, they got to do the opposite. So there's this level of code switching and competency and fluency that's really important. And then also communalism. Communalism is really important because African American children need to understand that it's not just about them. And they do need to understand the sense of legacy and the sense of history and have a sense of, feel a sense of comfort and be able to rest on that, okay? So while things may not necessarily always be working to your benefit, while you may engage in interactions that don't feel so good, getting them to understand that there have been forces and will continue to be forces beyond them that have worked to their benefit because they are part of a collective and a community and a history that is rich and important. So communalism, flexibility, active engagement. And then I was thinking about some other things. You know, it's interesting. Well, racial achievement comes up again, but this is a little different. I know I named it the same thing, but with this racial achievement, what I have found really interesting in working with the families I work with is that education is important, totally important. And I've had parents that will make sure that that child will get to school every day without being absent, but will not step foot in the school because they don't trust the teachers, they don't trust that environment. But they're going to get that child to school because they know school is important, okay? Which I find really interesting. And again, I find strength. The parents want to, the teachers want to fuss about, oh, the parent never comes, and the parent is not at PTA, and the parent this, and parent, but that parent is getting that child to school every day, no matter what. That's resilience, and that's strength. But it's almost like this rallying around that student or that child. It's almost like, I'll give an example. You know, when you have a dissertation or thesis, right? Are y'all's open up to the public? Technically, it should, right? I mean, you have dissertation and thesis committees, you got the whole community coming. One of my doctoral students is going to be graduating. She will be defending her dissertation March 1st, okay? We have had to get a larger room, auditorium, because she's got about 30 family members coming to this defense. They don't know what it's going to be about. They don't know the process, but they're like caravanning down the road to this defense. Because she's defending, oh, yeah, you know, we got to go. And they are coming in droves. That is so huge. That is huge. And she's the only one really to have gotten this far in school. And it's almost like the whole community is rallying around her. I don't even think everybody there is related to her, honestly. And so we literally have had to get another room and then another room so that when her committee needs to deliberate, we figured, well, it's probably best for us to leave and go deliberate in another room than to tell everybody they got to leave. They don't care about the process. And she's talking about, you know, Dr. Coard, you know, I just want you to know you may hear a little call and response, you know, when we're doing, I said, well, you know, you gotta let them know what the protocol is, the process, right? Because I can see it now. I'm like, you know, talking and trying to give feedback. Amen. Yes, yes, yes. Preach that. Mm-hmm. Yes. And so I'm just like, I'm like, it's such an important, you know, example of racial achievement and rallying, and the idea that we can't do it, but we're gonna make sure you do it, and we're gonna make sure you feel good in that, right? And we're coming to support you. Great example. Another way that I see racial socialization or resilience showing its face is with strong work ethic and the hustle mentality. And I gotta tell you, you know, people think of hustle in different ways. And when you think hustle, let's be honest, you probably think something bad or not so lawful. I don't know, right? But I'll tell you, there's something about working with these families that are hustling. And I don't mean breaking the law hustling. And they may not be telling me, and they may be, but, and I'm not gonna get into that because that still could be resilience, okay? Even in risk, there's resilience. And I gave some of the students and some others that I was talking with earlier some examples of some very negative, maladaptive behaviors, probably unlawful. But I was like, but do you see the resilience in there? You know, but that hustle mentality, it's the idea that you don't put your eggs in all one basket, okay? You gotta be ready to move, you gotta be ready to do, you gotta be ready to take on, you gotta be ready, you just don't know what's gonna happen, okay? And you gotta be prepared to, you know, take an opportunity when it hits, okay? And then take another opportunity when it hits. You can't get too comfortable. And so some people may look at that type of behavior and like, he is all over the place, or she just got to get it together. My goodness. But that hustle is what keeps a lot of these families together. I'm going to tell you, And it is so empowering. It's so, to me, it's very inspirational to even watch. Okay, because again, we complain about that one job that we got to get to, right? But there are folks that hustling, it's a way that they navigate, negotiate this world that they live in. And because they're not sure how long that they have this opportunity here because of racism, because of discrimination, because of limited opportunities, they're going to make sure that they have something over here, okay? And there are times, you know, I'll tell you probably a little too much information, but I'll tell you there are times when when it's speaking to my daughters, I'm like, don't underestimate the young man that's got to hustle. Now, I don't want him to be breaking the law, but if he's doing a few things, there's a strategy there. It may not make sense to you or to me, but that's coping. And he's being productive, and he's navigating his world, his spaces and his places, and he's doing his thing. And so if something falls through, he's the one that's going to pick himself up and say, okay, well, I'm just going to go over here. Where somebody else might be like, well, that wasn't in my plan. What am I going to do? I don't have a plan B. I have to do this because, it's just a different mindset. So I think sometimes we see it as being fragmented and disjointed, but I see that as resilience. I really do. And of course, spirituality and faith, that's definitely something that families I work with, and even if they don't necessarily belong to any particular faith, just the fact that they feel that there's a larger power and that they're going to be okay. And that feeds their soul, and it feeds them in terms of navigating and negotiating racism. And there are probably others that you can think about. So now the work has even now evolved into what has been coined racial literacy. Howard Stevenson is at the University of Penn, actually is a mentor of mine, and we've collaborated and worked together, and he talks about that in the very first slide when I talked about problem solving, and then I moved into critical mindedness. He really taps into that critical mindedness piece. So what I've tried to do is show from sort of a basic general perspective to more of an intentional, clinical, strategic theory. So Howard says that kids have to be able to read, and these are talking about your environments. They got to be able to read their environments, go into an environment, decode, interpret, appraise. And kids need to learn to do this earlier and earlier ages, but the reality is that certain environments can lead to certain consequences, and African American youth need to be able to assess that very early on. Similar to what I said, when you walk into a certain setting, you got to kind of know what you're dealing with, okay? And you see this sometimes with situations where you may be in an environment where you're the only one, or you just see a few of you. And you kind of look, make that contact, that eye contact, like, I see you, you see me. It's something that's natural that you do. It's a coping mechanism. Okay, let me see what I'm dealing with. Oh, okay, all right, I see you. Okay, 1, 2, 3, maybe. But honestly, guys, it's being able to assess that situation, whether you're out in the community, whether you're, in the classroom, reading even in the classroom, being able to assess, is this, okay, how am I going to manage this class? Is this something I can be able to say what I have to say? How is this going to be received? Who's going to say it? There's all this that goes on in the mind that a lot of folks are able to take for granted that African American youth cannot take for granted. Then he talks about recasting, reappraising, rewriting the stereotype narratives, okay? So again, he's talking about race-related traumas and race-related racial discrimination situations. So you go into a situation, you decode, okay, this is going to be a hot mess right here. I can tell right now what may be going on, and I can tell how I'm being perceived. And so you're assessing it for what it is. And then he says recasting is reappraising, rewriting, and basically that's what we would call, I guess, what cognitive restructuring. It's kind of like, okay, I see this, okay. And you got to think, okay, this is what they're saying, but I'm going to think about it this way because that's what's going to help me to then do the resolve, which is the healthy decision making around how to handle that stressful moment. Okay? So it's going into an environment, reading the situation, recasting, rewriting what may be stereotype perceptions and narratives, and then resolving it in what he says is a healthy, more adaptive way. And sometimes, in rewriting and reappraising, reappraisal and rewriting, it may be the decision not to respond. Because one of the things that, again, is a sense of resilience and coping is to understand that every action doesn't require a response. Sometimes you just don't need to respond, or you can't respond. You got to pick your battles. So his approach, the racial literacy, is comprised of the legacy approach, which is sort of the traditional racial socialization content, the general advice or coping. You have to work twice as hard to be considered half as good as whites, okay? The message. The literacy approach is basically where he's focused on the read, rehearse, the recall, and the enactment of direct, practiced approaches. Call them role plays, whatever you want to call them. Very different response. It can feel painful when someone is treating you as racially inferior, but remember, it's based on false myths of superiority and is meant to be destructive to your definition of self, your family, your people, your culture. So you can choose any of the strategies we've rehearsed to reject that inferiority. So again, his thought is we need to move beyond sort of the legacy. We acknowledge it and we pay homage to it. It's important. But we need to move on to some deeper strategies here. That it's not enough to just, be telling that. You need to move to some deeper, and this has such huge implications for clinical interventions and for really doing real work to get parents and families to understand how to move to that deeper level. Just look at this. I mean, of course, this sounds all real nice, but it's for the purposes of illustration. I don't know if it would come out that way necessarily if someone's talking about it, but it can feel painful when someone is treating you. So, you're validating right there the fact that it's painful, right? And then you're telling it what it's based on. It's based on false and what it's meant to do. I mean, you can see the recasting. You can see the restructuring, the cognitive restructuring. And then you can see that basically there's a choice to be made. Now that you're grounded, now that you understand what this is, how are we going to handle it? How are we going to respond? And you've got to be able to understand, and you have to acknowledge the fact that, knowledge is power, and being able to have a repertoire of tools and strategies is so incredibly key, so that when these incidents happen, they can make appropriate choices and strategies, and they're not just responding out of emotion. Because they've already recast it. They've already refigured it. They've placed it on that person, not on themselves. I mean, they're at a different place emotionally. Their anxiety is less. I mean, they're at a point where, okay, now I think I can respond. Before that, who knows? The response may land them in jail or get them kicked out of the classroom or whatever. So this is so important, and I think has such huge implications for intervention. Really, it really does. Because the intervention that I run, Black Parenting Strengths and Strategies, is for younger children, I can't do that at this level, but we do role plays. And so I can see younger children being able to benefit from role plays and giving them vignettes and situations and doing role plays through play to get them to understand and get their voice around these incidences. So when they're on the playground or at school and these incidences happen, you know, you can't be Annie because Annie's white and you're not white. You can't be Annie in the play. That the child has a comeback. They have something that they can say back. Well, my mom says I can be Annie because I'm smart and I know how to sing. I don't know, whatever. But the point is to be able to have a comeback. That's so powerful to be able to have a comeback. You ever had an interaction, you left, you like, darn. You're like, shoot, I know. You're like, and all these comebacks are coming to you, and you're just like, I could have said this, I could have said that. But in the moment, you were just like, oh man. We don't want the in race-related race interactions in these racial discriminative matters. We don't want that because that's not only going to probably result in a response that is not adaptive. It will also likely be internalized, and it will also oftentimes not be very mentally healthy at all. So why is racial socialization important? Well, in terms of child development, all of these things, it is what it is, and we need to help kids to understand and to develop strategies. And it has major implications for how they interact with those kids that look like them and don't look like them. And at the end of the day, we want children to feel good in their own skin, and we want them to be able to have positive interracial relationships as well. But it also, at a deeper level, it's got major implications, like I said, for interventions. It's got healing properties. It reduces anxiety, promotes self-efficacy, promotes emotion regulation. You don't have to respond in the way you think you may have responded in the past, or how they may think you're going to respond. It promotes racial coping agency, and to think critically and consciously to resolve racial conflict. So there's all sorts of ways that we can think about how to continue this work. There's so much that can be done with this. Again, I mentioned other sources of socialization. We're focusing on parents because, again, families are the primary socializing agent, particularly parents. But, we also have to think about how racial socialization looks in the school setting. Teachers are doing racial socialization, whether they believe it or not. Doctors' offices, physicians are doing racial socialization, whether they think it or not. So we got to really think about different places and spaces that children and families are engaging with, and think about how these messages are being transmitted. And again, using that recast as a way of responding to those situations. Within group variations, I think I was talking to a student earlier talking about within group variation, and he was interested in looking at African populations. We are such a diverse people. There is more within group variation than there is intergroup variation, okay? And so histories with our socio-historical histories and our understanding and experiences of racism are very different. I've had some very interesting discussions with my colleague who is from Africa. And we talk about racial socialization, and it's very interesting to get her perspective. And she's really been challenged with, wow, this is something that y'all do here? Like, we don't do this in Africa. Like, we don't have to do this in Africa. But we talk about sort of those within group variations and how we need to stay true to those lived experiences. Racial socialization practices, again, doing research based on the environment, what are the messages that are most important? What are the skill sets that are important to instill? And then continue to develop interventions for them, of course. So I contend that all families are racially socializing their children. They're just doing it differently. Some are doing it better than others, but it is a very critical point of intervention because they need support. They need to be able to navigate these race-related challenges. Now, this would be, it would be optimal if racism would go away. I don't know when that will happen. So it's important that we deal with it head on and help families to navigate and negotiate those situations. And so I really would like to see us to unpack these protective mechanisms. I really would like us to get away from this idea of like, oh, it's race, I don't know what to do with it, let's control for it, let's this and that, and really delve into it and not be afraid of it. And I just really think it merits attention from all of us because I think we all play a role in how socialization messages are being transmitted as well as how we are receiving youth and families, either in our research or in our clinical practices or wherever we're working with them. And I promise not at risk. I guess my point is that I truly believe that there is promise and resilience and strength in every family, in every individual. Now, it may be very hard to find it. You may have to get deep and it may be unconventional. But, and I was giving some examples with the students earlier about situations where I've been asked to come in and consult with a situation, and you're like, ooh, what in the world? Like, that's just horrible. But how if you look beneath all that, there's a point of intervention, and there's strength, and until you are able to sort of tap into that, then I really feel it's going to be very difficult to bring about any change and to really do good work with the families that you work with. And so I like to think of it as being at promise and not at risk, although I would say all African American families are at some level of risk because of racism, but in the midst of that, they're still at promise because they're doing stuff. They're doing stuff to navigate and negotiate, and we just need to give them, some skills and help them and support them in doing that in a way that's strategic and purposeful and intentional. And I've seen it happen, so thank you. Yeah. It's my time. I don't even know what time
Thanks
it is.
so much. It's captivating. We do. We have some time. It was a captivating lecture, and with so many rich synergies to work and themes at the school. I have many questions, but I'd like to, invite the audience to begin the question session. Would anybody like to start?
Thank you. It was very interesting, and you have such amazing presentation presence.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. My question is about: have you ever worked with incarcerated African American youth, like juveniles, and people arrested for juvenile situations? But then, how would this apply in terms of the family, especially since they are removed from their family for a while, something like that?
So how would you do that? Okay, so let me back up. So in terms of working, I have not worked directly with incarcerated youth because I haven't gone into a jail. But I have worked with kids that have histories and who are considered adjudicated delinquents. I've been to the court many times to testify for that type of thing. What I think would be really interesting that's actually on my research career bucket list would be to really think about, to think about transitions from jail to family transitions and how racial socialization can impact how that influences their transitions from jail to their families. I think about that. I thought about how what would be really interesting is to think about how to do racial socialization interventions within jail settings and facilitate interactions during visits with family members and their children, women with their children, fathers with their children. So I think that there are definitely ways in which it can be done to help with reintegration of families. And I think when when an adolescent or whoever that person is gets, I don't know the legal term, but they get close to having to leave and leave jail or prison, that there's a nice, I think, sweet spot in preparation and how healing it could be just to give them those strategies to then use on the outside. You know what I'm saying? So I see it again, healing and being preparatory because they're receiving racial socialization messages, but also they're receiving the skills to then transmit to their child. So I definitely see it as a way to impact parent-child relationships of prisoners, absolutely. But I've never done it.
I'm going to ask a question and almost invite you to that space. Jeremy Agumbe here at Brown, he's a minister, a black minister, and he did a racial awareness thing at our church for about 4 weeks. And one of the big things he talked about and showed the categorization of families separated and then how we can, as a group, as a society, get in there and do exactly what you just said. So there are steps being done in adopting families and things of that nature. So I'm going to then invite him to have this exchange with you.
Absolutely.
Because I think there are boots on the ground already in motion, and that just is a perfect segue.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely, and there are definitely people that are in the prisons doing great work and have that population, and totally. I was also going to say, you were talking about families that are, fragmented for whatever reason. I did, recently, a colleague and I got a grant funded to look at racial socialization in kinship care families, because you have sort of a situation where, the child's placed with kinship, but the parent is in and out, or maybe not even around, so how do you facilitate that even within the kinship family? And I could think, wow, like it could even get more complicated in other things like adoptive families and other, there are all sorts of ways in which children are being cared for and in which families present, right? And so I see this being something that needs to be applied across the board. I was also talking with a student about how when we were, one of the projects I'm doing, we've developed what we call One Talk at a Time, the video series, helping parents to have these courageous conversations. Black, African American, Mexican American, and Chinese American. And we are looking at commonalities, but also unique experiences. And so we have this video series that we're getting feasibility data on. But in doing the filming company, which is two white women who do great documentary work, a lot of advocacy, social justice types of documentaries. We're like, how do we do this? Like, white families need to know how to do this. And I totally agree. I think, we spend a lot of time talking amongst us and talking about our own experiences, but at some point, white families need to be part of this dialogue, and I think sooner rather than later. I think it's really important to think about what racial socialization looks like in white families. I mean, we do know that there is white racial socialization, but it's very different when you are socializing from the perspective of privilege as opposed to non-privilege, let's just say. So those are very different perspectives. But what I think would be really important is to think about how parents, white parents, can socialize their child beyond, we're all human, or beyond colorblind ideology to how to be white allies. How do you fight against it? When you see it, how do you advocate? How can you be part of the solution as opposed to avoiding it and just riding on privilege?
Dr. Coard, other questions?
Thank you so much for this. In terms of your research in the different situations where you find yourself in and talking about these problems with different families and the kids in those families, have you seen any trends in regions and kind of how they're talked about differently? Because in my experience as well as others' experience, I both kind of grew up knowing family in more southern states and more northern states and more western states. That conversation can be very different based on the interactions people have had in their societies. So I was wondering if you've had any thoughts on that and if you wanted to comment on it.
I do. Actually, I started this work in New York. I was on faculty at NYU, and I started this work in New York. And for those of you who don't know, New York is very ethnically grounded. okay? Every week there's a different ethnic parade. I mean, really, there's a celebration of ethnicity. I think it's fabulous, you know? But you don't call a Dominican an African, a Haitian, a Jamaican, you know? You don't call, I mean, you know, people are very true to who they are, and they celebrate it. And so I was trained, you know, in starting this work, I was trained to really think ethnically, okay? So I wanted to be very clear. How do you identify, and from where are you pulling the source of values and heritage? Then I went to North Carolina, and I'm, again, collecting data, and I'm talking to families, and I'm using all this, and they're like, what? We just black folk down here. And I'm like, you mean I did all that work, and now I gotta come down here? And y'all just black folk? I mean, the history of race is just very different. It's not as much ethnic grounding. So I had to switch it up a little bit. And so now I've just gotten really comfortable with just trying to assess to what degree, sort of how do they identify? And trying to think about, you know, to what extent my intervention is addressing them and their lived experiences in the way that they identify. And I think it's really important to ask those questions rather than assume, because, yeah, I tended to have to ask, you know, interview and ask those questions so I could get a handle on that, because it was very different from being in New York. So absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really great. I had a question about if you've come across mixed race families and thinking about how kind of these messages can be really confusing, especially when you're both African American and white, or Asian and white, or Asian and African American, and how, right, that parenting message can get even more complex than just a lot of the things that you've laid out here.
Yeah. No, you ask a great question. We were talking earlier. I mean, the world is getting more and more. I mean, it's all nice, right? But it's complex. And I've had to stay true to who I am in terms of what I can speak to and what I can't. So I've had many parents who, white mothers of children who are biracial, for example, say, well, can we be in your parenting intervention, Black Parenting Strengths and Strategies? And it's hard because I get it, and not that I don't think that there aren't things that they could get from that intervention that would help, but I have to stay true to the fact that my intervention does not speak to a whole nother side of that child. And I don't want to label or you know, pigeonhole a child or a family. And so it gets real complicated. It depends if the mother is white, what the mother, because we know that you know, it gets very complicated. And we also know that biracial identity is different than Black racial identity, white racial identity. It's its own theory, it's its own measures, it's different. And so what I basically tell families is, I do think that that, again, something on my bucket list, but I think that I appreciate the fact that based on what the child looks like, that parents need to use that as a starting point, okay? Because you can be biracial and look very brown, and you need to go with that because that's how society's going to view them, okay? And so I get where it's coming from, and I know it's important, but that's a whole nother literature, and I feel like I would be doing a disservice by saying, okay, yeah, come in here to this Black parenting group. It just doesn't address the other pieces. But yeah, I've had many, it's been mainly white mothers that have said, you know, I have this biracial child, and I really, you know, need something. And so I think that that's something that definitely needs to happen. But at this point, I don't feel like I'm adequately able to address it. Very important. And yeah, and it's not even just black and white, right? I mean, it's a lot. Right, yeah.
Thanks for a very nice presentation.
Thank you.
This week I was at the nicotine and tobacco meetings, and the director of National Institute of Minority Health, Eliseo, was presenting, and he said a comment that sort of we've thought about a lot is that there's very little work and research with middle-class African Americans in this country. And as you know, I've been doing work with African Americans for 26 years, and our work has always generally been with lower income urban African Americans. And I would just sort of want to throw that out. And I think thinking about lessons learned, resilience, and thinking about what are the assets that come to those families, because there are obviously a lot of middle and upper middle class African Americans in cities that are, you know, Atlanta and DC come to mind, that where African Americans do very well. The other thing is that, just sort of as a comment that you can reflect on, is that I read this about half a year ago or something, looking at sort of the standard chart of income, mean income of families of sort of people in this country and immigrant groups. And so what comes to mind for most people always is sort of Asians, that they have the highest mean income for families, which is the data I've always seen. I was very surprised to see the following group, if anyone wants to guess, of an immigrant group that now is way above Asians.
East Indian?
Someone said it, I think. Yes, Nigerians. Their mean income. Good job. Jennifer. Prize for Jennifer. Free lunch for Jennifer. But isn't that interesting? And I was actually just with my friend who's Nigerian, who's my mentees now, department chair at a med school. They have done very well. And it's just, I mean, obviously their lived experiences are different, and sort of the history and the intergenerational issues are different. But it seems like one could learn, because they also face a lot of issues about racism that are different but similar. Anyway, I just throw that out.
Yeah, I definitely think, well, all that. I think the immigration experience is different. Okay, refugee experience is different. I think that in terms of middle class, okay, or upper middle class, wealthy, if those, you know, we talked about that earlier. Okay, I would contend, my belief is that regardless of that, that you're still at some level of risk because of racism, because at the end of the day, people don't know what's in your pocketbook, okay, when they look at you, okay? But with that said, I haven't, you know, it's interesting because I actually tried to do a study with middle class and upper middle class families, and it didn't get funded, and I think there was this perception that they didn't need it, like the low income. And that's so not true. And I say that I can only speak anecdotally. I mean, the places and spaces I, you know, go in aren't low-income places, okay? And so I talk about this with my friends and colleagues and so forth. Racial socialization definitely plays out there too. But what's interesting is that you will hear sort of tidbits of, oh, well, you know, we've got resources and it's, you know, it's not as much of an issue for us because we can, you know, put our children in the best places and spaces, right? But what I have to remind them is that that can place them even at greater risk, because what you do is you have the resources to give them the best education, right? Put them in the best school where they're the only one, and then they don't even know how to navigate that school. And then they also have to navigate why race is important with peers that don't look like them, and then they have to navigate peers that look like them that don't get their school context. So they're in between. So there is a need for Black families that are wealthy or well-to-do, well-resourced, for them not to sleep because it impacts them as well. I just think that they have more resources in order to provide various exposure. So that flexibility sometimes is easier because they've been able to expose them to different events and different experiences, right? And so sometimes they can become more savvy in that way and engage their community. But then it's also hard because then there are times when they don't know how to engage their own community. I remember purposely taking my son. My son was at a school where he was, you know, was predominantly white. Great school. But then I also made sure I took him down to other parts of town because I wanted him to be able to play pickup ball too. Like I wanted him to feel comfortable to go in other areas that didn't look like where he lived, play basketball, do whatever, interact, socialize with people that look like him, and then be able to also, interact with people at his school. But that was intentional. But I see even now, I mean, most of his friends tend to be friends that are associated with hockey. And sometimes I see sort of the back and forth, and sometimes it's a challenge because, the friends he has that look like him don't get hockey. They're not interested in hockey. And then he goes to his hockey friends, and they're like, well, aren't you supposed to play basketball? Aren't you playing football? It's a crazy. So it's a different way of navigating, but that flexibility is incredibly important. You just have more money to, expose you to doing it. That's all.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you so much. It's been so great
Sure.
getting to talk with you earlier and then hear your presentation today. And when you're talking about, families of color that have, financial privileges or things like that, where they get to expose them to different spaces that minorities don't typically, you think of them to be able to go in those areas and have those experiences. It made me think of a time, so growing up, my sister, she's also half Black like me, same parents, and we got to, go to like great schools and exposed to so many great activities and blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, it didn't change the fact that like there were those inappropriate, hurtful, and overwhelming remarks, and like didn't really matter like what my address was or like what vacation I went on last summer. Like I was reminded that like I was not a part of that group. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And not to say that like my friends that are close to me would never say anything like that, and their parents are so kind and loving, but it doesn't change the fact that like even if you have all the economic tools and skills, like the reality is like there's emotional violence that happens. And especially when you're saying like the whole gender differences, like yes, like as a Black female, like I don't have to worry about, I mean, let's hope not, but like I don't have to worry. I've never been like physically harmed because of my race. I'm not perceived as threatening it just hasn't been my experience. But there's been other like emotional violence, things like that. And also like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, I feel like African-American women are sexualized so much with like the media and stuff. And like, it's like, how do you go home and have those conversations, when you're in high school and stuff? It's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And anyways, I was just thinking about how like, yeah, it does need to be applied to any spectrum, especially if you're attributing your emotional well-being and your physical safety to money. That's a huge problem, because what if like you lose your money?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So anyways, that's it.
Yeah.
And thank you
those
so much.
intersections, economics, gender, sexual orientation, all those things complicate it even more, right? I mean, so yeah, part of racial socialization with a girl will have to include sort of those gender misperceptions, and particularly if you're an African-American girl and you're well-developed and you're developing early, there are certain messages that these young girls get about their intentions when that's not what their intentions are at all. I've had adolescent girls tell me, all she wanted to do is just wear what other girls wear to school. But because her body looks different, she's been sent home and she can't wear those things. And so, having discussions around perceptions and, whether they're positive or negative is just so incredibly important, because it's part of our reality. It just is. But yeah, what you're bringing up are all the intersections that are so important as well. But I contend that if you add race to any of those things, your positionality changes. I mean, if you have two gay men, make one Black, one white, two poor women, make one, race is so incredibly powerful, but means absolutely nothing at the same time. It's crazy. But that's why I focus on race, and I call race what it is. I mean, it's race. I mean, skin color. It means nothing, but it means everything, So, yeah, you just bring up the complexity of it all. Absolutely.
Dr. Coard has given us a lot to think about, and I think there's a chance to connect with her as we develop this area of resilience in the school. So please join me in thanking Dr. Coard, and it's great to see all of you today.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.